Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Bloomberg Opinion Chat about the UK election, something we've been trying to do weekly as we head toward the July 4th UK general election. Happily, I'm joined again by two Bloomberg Opinion colleagues, Marcus Ashworth and Adrian Wooldridge. We're going to attempt to cover a range of topics, the question of what a supermajority means, the future of the Conservative Party, and where Nigel Farage's Reform Party fits into all of this, plus which is the party of business. So to set the scene, we've got a little over 1 week left before Britain votes for what is expected to be a major power change from Conservative to Labour government for the first time in 14 years. There's a debate tonight. So with the caveat that anything can happen in politics, it does seem we've reached a sort of stasis. We've had the manifestos, we've seen lots of policy proposals and not much movement, I guess, in the polls. The last week has been dominated by a new sort of mini scandal over betting, as it turns out that a number of Tory officials and candidates placed wagers on the timing of the election. And that will no doubt remind many voters of scandals past. There have almost been too many to list. So let's have a look at a chart of the polls if we can. Marcus, we haven't really seen a narrowing in the sense of the two main parties coming closer together as we might have expected. What's your take on where the polls are and whether the betting issue would cut through to voters, bearing in mind that something like 22.5 million people place bets in this country every year?
Well, I'm just worried about the democratic mandate that perhaps that Labour get here, which is clear in the broadest sense. I think they deserve to obviously have a commanding majority, and we'll get that. But if you look at the amount of votes that Labour are getting, that's actually dropping to quite, one of the lowest we've seen probably this year so far. May even get on to 40%. That's a little, perhaps because people, I guess, think they don't have to turn up and vote because Labour are going to win by a landslide. And I think at the same time, clearly the Conservative vote has dropped sharply away, but some are predicting that the combined Labour-Tory vote will be the lowest for over 100 years, which, I guess that's maybe a sense of boredom, a sense of frustration, but equally, and that the Labour's going to win hands down. But I don't think that's particularly great. And we do know that Reform obviously will do optically well on vote share, but that probably will translate into a very low seat count, maybe only 5 or 10 at best. Likewise, interestingly, I think we may see the Liberal Democrats probably outperforming the number of seats it gets compared to what you would normally expect in this first past the vote, two main party type system we have here in the UK.
Well, yeah, that leads me to wonder about the Tory campaign strategy. Well, it seems to have been a sort of two-part campaign strategy.
We were all wondering about that.
Yeah. The first half of the Tory campaign seemed to be throw out as many policies as possible and see what sticks. And then they've, when the polls didn't move, they've pivoted, and the strategy now seems to be to warn of a Labour supermajority, a word that we really didn't hear in the lexicon of sort of British political terms until this election, as far as I'm aware. Adrian, can you tell us, is there such a thing as a supermajority, or do you just get a majority in the UK Parliament and that pretty much means that the governing party decides what it wants to do policy-wise?
No, there is no such thing in the British lexicon as a supermajority. It's an American term, which means that you have more than 2/3, so you can override vetoes and get stuff through. What we're really talking about is a big majority. But what a big majority means in the United Kingdom is almost absolute power. Because we don't have the system that America has of checks and balances, and we don't have off-year elections every 2 years. So essentially, if you capture power in Britain, you've captured something that's very real, and there's almost nothing that can stop you pushing through your policies. There's no checks and balances. Now, under the Conservative Party, there was a sort of constraint on your power in the sense that the permanent civil service, what the Tories like to dub the blob, were pretty critical of you. The BBC was pretty critical of you. You're operating in a sort of fairly hostile environment. Now you're going to have a world in which the Labour Party not only captures power in Westminster, but is also surrounded by allies in Whitehall and in what might be termed the higher media, and the lower media, the Telegraph and the Tory supporting newspapers like the Mail will be functionally irrelevant. So we will not have seen so much power in one place in Britain for a very, very long period of time.
I would just
Interesting.
like to add,
Yeah.
sorry, just quickly add one. I would definitely include the judiciary into the blob of media and civil service. And there's been some interesting articles about quite how Labour will control stuff through the judiciary. But the one right out of that very quickly is the House of Lords can, in theory, stop or block for up to a year some government legislation. So in effect, I think Labour probably will have an effective majority in the House of Lords, but not a literal one. So they could, in a sense, delay some stuff, though not permanently block.
So the reality is that the warnings of Starmageddon don't really reflect the practical, the practicalities of governing. But I also wonder whether they're backfiring for the Tories, because if you are a conservative inclined voter and you've been told you've looked at the polls and it doesn't look like you've got a prayer, and then you're told that there's going to be a Labour supermajority. I mean, doesn't that suggest that many of those voters are going to just sit home? I wonder whether it was even a good strategy to kind of warn of a supermajority in that sense. It doesn't seem to be working for certain.
Well, backfiring and Tories seem to be words that are almost always linked together at the moment. Almost everything they seem to do is wrong. But I'm not sure it is such a bad strategy. I think that when people go and vote, shy Tories or Tories who've been alienated by the Brexit and the incompetence of the Tories, when they go and vote, I think they may come back home, partly because they're worried about Starmer having too much power, and partly because they think, well, if I vote for this Tory candidate, I won't be endorsing the last few years. I will be putting a bit of a check on the power of the Labour Party.
I would just say that the actual fact, in some ways, the latter part of the Tory campaign has been quite successful in pinning Labour in on tax rises in particular. They have managed to get a few things out of Labour to sort of curtail perhaps their ambitions. We've had a lot of vague responses from Labour, but equally they have, quite willingly gone along with sort of conservative ideas on what taxes will not be touched. So you could argue that it's a defence strategy. They're also starting to give themselves, we'll go on to this in a minute, but we're starting to see the Tories saying things which they haven't come up with yet, but that's more to how they play in opposition, that they'll be able to sort of hold Labour to account on certain things because they said they would be doing X, Y, and Z. And that's quite an interesting tactic. So all intents and purposes, this election is done and dusted for Labour. The Tories are now moving into a defence mode to try and limit their losses and equally giving themselves something in opposition to be able to hold a very, very strong Labour government to some form of account.
Yeah, I think that Marcus makes a fundamental point there, that this election is essentially over. It's just a question of the size of the majority. And somebody in one of the newspapers today said it's like that period when your aeroplane has landed and you're waiting to get off, and the jet is being put there, and people getting their suitcase and actually walking off. There's nothing really big to play for. And this debate tonight will be, as boring as an England football match. It's just that we're waiting to get off the plane and adjust to the airport.
Yeah. So July 5th, the Conservatives are going to be faced with this picture that we're now painting, this dismal picture, and they're going to have to figure out what comes next. And that means leadership, but that even more importantly means the direction of the party. What do they stand for? What is conservatism these days? Adrian, you've written a lot about this. You've, I think, written fairly recently that, the problem isn't just the chaos. It isn't just, one scandal after another. Yes, voters lost trust, and that can be pretty terminal. You also noted that the Tories confused voters with the succession of government that seemed to be four different things and put, different emphasis. How do they reconcile that and this motley coalition that Boris Johnson put together in 2019 that was never going to hold? How do they begin to move forward from July 5th, and with whom?
A very good question. I think one of the most interesting things about British politics at the moment is we're going to have a Starmer government, but a lot of attention will be focused on what's happening to the Tories, despite their complete drubbing, because they're still a very interesting story, and they face an absolutely crucial decision as to whether they go back to being a sort of a good government party that tries not to be entirely centrist, but tries to put the values of stability and common sense and administrative competence at the heart of what they do, or whether they go down the Farage direction and say that we're a populist party. I think the majority of it's very difficult to know who's going to survive and who's not going to survive. I think things that I've seen suggest that the majority of people who will survive will be more in the One Nation camp than in the Farage right-wing camp. But on the other hand, there'll be powerful forces pulling the Conservative Party to the right. One of which is what's happening on the continent, with this shift, with this rise of the populist right, and of course in the United States with the Trump factor. And the other and the most important one here will be whether Farage wins his seat in Saudi. Because if he does win that seat, he'll be able to be a sort of foghorn. And he was incredibly good in the European Parliament of building a movement by just shouting and shouting and shouting and reiterating the same points and tickling the emotions that everybody feels, frustration with the European blob and the rest of it. And if he does that in Parliament, which is a very, very big place, to be in terms of using your megaphone, he will have a big impact on Conservative politics.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I wanted to get to Farage in a minute, but let's go straight to Farage, because you can't talk about the Conservative Party now, remarkably, without talking about the Reform Party, which nobody was talking about with any degree of seriousness before this election was called. So we're really in very different political, terrain here. I do wonder a little bit whether we've seen peak Farage in terms of this campaign. I think we have a clip of a Reform candidate on the campaign trail. Let's see if we can.
I'll tell you what I want, what I really, really want. I'll tell you what I want, what I really, really want. I want a Reform win.
Not the most attractive.
It's politics, Jim, and not as we know it.
I mean, Marcus, blue wall voters, they tend to be professionals and graduates. They prioritize issues like housing and the environment. They're not as worried about immigration as some of the issues that really tickle the core Reform vote. They tend to be more socially liberal. I don't think you
can say that anymore. I'm sorry. That would be the conventional view, but we've upended everything this election. I think we've seen a real disgust with the Tory party for a number of different reasons. And therefore, I think even in the blue wall, now you're getting a big divide between people who are still possibly these One Nation, Disraeli sort of, as you said, perhaps the sort of good government for government for all style. I guess you put Cameron, Theresa May, and I was about to say you might want to put Boris Johnson in there, but leave him aside for the moment. But, certainly, I think Farage has struck a chord with an awful lot of potential Tory voters, particularly among the elderly, but not just there. And I think that's what's caused such a separation. And the important part is the membership of the Conservative Party. Yeah. So what happens at the moment, in theory, is that what's left of the MPs will decide two candidates to put forward to the membership, who then will vote, which is why the second Boris Johnson's name came on it. He was instantly going to win. And, clearly if Farage ever were to be allowed in, which already we've seen some of the potential leadership candidates ruling out, secondly left Farage in the hen house, and if his name was ever put forward to the Tory membership, you would see Farage as the next leader of the Conservative Party. If
Farage does seem to have the same ability as Boris Johnson to appeal to this rather strange coalition of the sort of stripy blazer, red corduroy trouser brigade of people in the south, and working class people in the north. This strange coalition of people who are economically very different, but who are essentially culturally conservative and are annoyed about a lot of things that are going on.
And I just wonder whether outside a galvanizing, unifying issue like Brexit, whether that coalition actually holds. And I think one interesting thing we saw in the last week is that at least two polls, one from JL Partners, one from Savant, show Reform down 3 and 2 points. And this, I think, just as Farage was claiming that NATO had provoked Putin into attacking Ukraine. I think there are two questions here. One is, how does Farage do in this election campaign? And maybe we have seen peak Farage in terms of his ability to get speed.
I don't think so. Can I just quickly say, if you add
Yeah.
together the Reform vote and presumably what the Tory vote will be, and compare it to what Labour's going to get, there is still an even split between, should we call it left and right in the UK. That's
Yeah.
not gone away. It's just that the Tory party has cut itself in half and maybe even more. The Liberal Democrats have benefited from that, but I think their votes that they will get are easily sold. So, in that sense, I do think there is something to be said in the next 3 or 4 years. And I think Labour itself are aware that they do not expect a 2029 election to be anything other than extremely hard fought, with a finally unified, centre right to right wing. Whether or not that continues to be split will be their dream. But if somehow Reform and Tory merge, then I do think there will be a sea change completely.
Adrian, do you see Nigel Farage as sorry, I wanted to ask you a quick fire question. Do you see Nigel Farage as a future leader of the Conservative Party?
No,
Maybe
I
not.
don't. I also think he's made a big mistake on the Putin point. It's interesting that the far right, as it were, in Europe is very divided over Putin. There are people like Meloni, who are anti-Putin, people like Le Pen, who, having been pro-Putin, have moved away and become anti-Putin. And I think to say the things that he said, sympathetic things about Putin, was a step too far. I mean, I think it was put him on the far right of the far right in Europe. I think it's difficult. I think Marcus is right that if you add up Reform and the Tories, you're not getting Armageddon. But it's hard to put that coalition back together because the left of the Tory party increasingly stands for a very different set of things from the populist wing of the right. Very hard to put that together. Meloni in Italy seems to have done quite well at doing that. She's got a mixture of economically conservative things with populist things, but it's hard. I mean, Boris tried to do it and failed, partly because he's Boris and partly because because things, because it's a hard set of things. How do you favor good government and economic stability and pro-business policies on the one hand, and favor tub thumping populism on the other? Meloni perhaps is the person they ought to be studying in.
I saw David Gauck, a former Tory minister, recently quoted as saying that his party was seen as being hostile to young people, hostile to international business, London, and its metropolitan values. And, the young people point, I think, is, okay, young people don't vote, right? So the Tories have never been that focused on them, but they've never had this kind of, rock bottom support from the young. I think in 1983, I read Thatcher had 42% of the 18 to 24 vote. John Major had 27%. The Tories currently are on 8%.
Except that there is quite an interesting number. The Reform Party's figures amongst the young aren't as bad as you'd think they would be, particularly given their persona. And you're beginning to get, and of course on the continent, in both Italy and Germany and also in France, the younger people are more likely to support populist parties because they're cut out of the system and are frustrated. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that the young will continue to flock to Starmer once he becomes the symbol of incumbency and incompetence and cronyism, as he inevitably will.
Yes. This is an important point. We're going on to business. Is that I think that business at the moment is wanting a little bit of stability, and clearly the get away from the upset of the last 8 years of constant media barrage on all sides. But if some of the things that Labour wants to bring in on the employment laws could see a real shift from business away, perhaps, from what Labour is claiming to be. There's a real risk that Labour's hopes and dreams will get dashed quite quickly if they push through some very pro-union type legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to maybe turn now to look at the policy agenda, because we've talked a little bit about the political landscape. Marcus, you and I both sat in on a Bloomberg debate between Kemi Badenoch, the business secretary, and her opposite number in the Labour Party, Jonathan Reynolds. They went head to head on a number of issues, including the sort of lack of skills that businesses are complaining about, in the workforce, on investment in the economy, where Badenoch said that we should not be, we should not take too seriously the figures that the UK is such a massive laggard in the G7 on investment, because as a services economy, these things are measured differently. I'm not sure that was very convincing for the audience there, but maybe give us a sense of what you thought of that head-to-head on some of those issues, and then maybe we can pick apart a little bit of what
I think the fascinating bit was Jonathan Reynolds was very relaxed, clearly did not want to rattle the horses or say anything, but he's not really going to be in power in the context of controlling policy. That's going to come very much from Starmer, Reeves, and even Sue Gray, I think. So that said, he did a perfectly excellent performance of saying essentially nothing, bar two key things. One, when the Thames Water subject came up, and it was very much that they did not want to give impression that Labour was going to step in and nationalise or support. Also, it was a vital utility. I rely on Thames Water, and I wouldn't want to see it not to deliver its services, even though they are rather poor. So that was quite interesting. Whether or not that will ever be the case and truly stressed, I doubt. I suspect they'll have to do something. But nonetheless, they're not there to say to bail out failed businesses. And the second thing was on this quite emotive issue, the Shein, Chinese controlled apparel firm. That he basically welcomed the IPO even when it comes. Where Badenoch, quite surprisingly, came out quite vociferously saying that there were two key elements they would want to, if the Tories were returned, questioned very, very heavily. One, which was the level of duty paid if goods are shipped under £140, and secondly, one on work practices in the region of Xinjiang, which there's been a lot of question on. I'm amazed I've not heard these two things from a Conservative government prior, but it shows you how they're moving into a opposition style stance to get ready to throw rocks at the Labour government.
Exactly. Exactly. I think we do maybe have a clip from that exchange on one of the subjects they clashed on. Let's see if we can show that.
Is the Labour government going to make life much more difficult for smaller businesses that drive Britain's growth?
Well, no, look, the Labour Manifesto, the Labour agenda, is what we call a pro-worker, pro-business agenda, and the agenda reflects that in its aggregate and total form. It's everything from a better business environment around changes to planning, to tax certainty, to how things like the skills system works. But we want that to deliver growth that every part of the UK and every person within it benefits from. And it gives people the chance to feel and participate in the economy, to have the benefits for themselves and their family that they're seeking. And it's been developed very closely with businesses to make sure those burdens are not too burdensome.
Kemi Badenoch, developed closely with business. Why has the Conservative Party not tried to introduce those kinds of measures?
Because business doesn't want them. I think it is unbelievable that Jonathan would actually suggest that those employment regulations have been developed with business. Which business? Business is terrified of what Labour is selling. And one of the things that's really interesting is to listen to how Labour talks. He's talking about Rishi Sunak being dishonest. He's talking about Liz Truss. This is very personal. They have no diagnosis of the fundamental problems of this country. All they can see is the individuals in the government. There is no, and if you do not have a good diagnosis, you have no solutions.
Okay,
what a good synopsis of that debate.
Sorry, Marcus, I cut you off.
No, it's a very good synopsis of how the two different styles. An excellent clip.
Exactly. Adrian, our global business columnist, does Kemi have a point? Is business terrified of what Labour's selling? Have they not been sufficiently consulted? What's your view?
I wish business were terrified of what Labour's selling, actually. I think the real problem is that business goes with whoever's going to be in power. And so they're going with the Labour Party. But you do have this sort of corporatism which is creeping in, both from the Labour Party and from the business world, which is Labour, which is the business and the unions and Labour and the workers will all work hand in hand. We'll have sort of lots of councils in Whitehall. We'll have who will help business to achieve what the sort of goals that it wants to achieve. We'll have this sort of nationalized energy company doing all of these things. We'll have this come-by-our world of cooperation between business, particularly big business, and the government. And that was the world that we had in the 1970s. So business is not always the best test of our long-term interests. We should be doing what's good for markets, not good for particular companies and particular groups of workers.
This reminds me very much of Japan, this corporate socialism, which is where the state and the business sector are entwined, and that's probably not long term very good. But that clearly is where business sees its butter, its bread is buttered. So,
yeah, I mean, I think it's the fundamental problem that Labour has. It may not be a problem in terms of winning the election, but it's a problem day one after they get into government. Is that they've had such a safe polling lead that they haven't had to acknowledge trade-offs. And we've had the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Bloomberg Intelligence all saying, the manifesto pledges don't quite add up. There are trade-offs that aren't acknowledged. But, come July 5th and those first 100 days in which Starmer has acknowledged that he has to move quickly, that's where, we're really going to see what Labour intends to do with the power that it's won. Marcus, we've heard from Jonathan Reynolds on growth and investment. We hear it constantly from Keir Starmer, obviously Rishi Sunak. Everyone is at least focused on the one thing the UK economy needs, tackling growth and productivity. The Labour plan pencils in an increase in day-to-day public spending above what the current Tory trajectory. So I think it goes from 1% of GDP to 1.2%. And so, that 20% sounds like a lot, but really in absolute terms, it's not, of course. It also means real terms cuts. And we said this every time we discuss it, but I think it bears repeating to so many, across the board. Where do you see, the growth coming from? Where do you see Labour being able to make an offer that's going to be pleasing to business? Obviously, planning is one thing.
It's planning. It's just planning, and more planning, and cutting through the Gordian knot of the National Planning Policy Framework, whatever it's called, which is the most ridiculous document, which is completely ossified all of not just housing market, but the development of everything from solar plants to wind farms to you name it. And if they can cut through that, which I don't believe they'll be able to, because it's impossible. It's like Japanese knotweed, so entwined. The civil service doesn't want to get out of its own way on this stuff. But I really hope they do. And if they can do even some element of that, that will improve growth. Whether or not we have the amount of plumbers and electricians and people can fit heat pumps and all the rest of it, let alone solar farms, I don't think we have, but that's a problem which they're going to rapidly come across. But if they can get some headway, cut through, allow councils to sort of get out their own way, and indeed business therefore to plan a bit more and get some stuff through, then growth, which I think is actually set quite fair. I think by the end of this year, anyway, I think growth will be running at or probably above a 1% annual rate, which doesn't sound very much, but that could head up to 1.5% to 2%. Fairly easily by this time next year, all things being equal, particularly if the Bank of England blesses us with some interest rate cuts, which I suspect they'll start doing from August, then we could have some momentum, add in some positive stability from the fact that we don't have this 8 years of stramash since 2016. Then maybe, just maybe, we'll get some, and then I think Labour will also start increasing, get out of the way of their own fiscal rules, shove some stuff on the Bank of England, which means they can spend more. So cautious optimism that they'll get some form of growth.
They haven't had to
share some of that. I would share some of that optimism. I do think that the planning, which is the Tory government has not tackled, is something that Labour can actually make some progress on, not just because they can exert pressure on Whitehall, because they'll have a big majority and they'll be powerful, but because their coalition is very different from the Conservative coalition. The Conservative coalition is essentially an anti-growth coalition of people who own their own houses, people who are pretty old, people who are asset rich, and the Labour coalition is much more representative of people who are hungry to get on the property ladder, who are hungry to see development, and
so
also,
less NIMBYism.
In cynical terms, why not build some houses in your enemy's constituencies? That is a good thing. The thing that really worries me in the longer term, this, listening to Reynolds there talking about we'll be good to Labour loves, the workers love us, the business loves us, come by, everybody loves us. You have to make trade-offs in order to make progress. And if you're going to have productivity growth, you have to introduce efficiency. You have to sack people. You have to destroy jobs. You can't have productivity growth and keep the labour force fixed where it is. And those are going to be very difficult decisions, having made all these promises to every incumbent interest group there is.
And I guess to Marcus's point, I mean, there is a national planning framework that needs to be reformed, and Labour said in its manifesto it will, but there's also the discretionary system of local council control that's very different from what operates in many other countries, which are more rule-based, that allow a sort of automaticity in planning approval once certain criteria have been met. I think that's much harder to roll back. I think
the enemies of growth and planning reform are not ultimately Whitehall or that maybe. Ultimately, they're the people. People don't want, that people don't want houses built in their back garden. I certainly don't, and I do anything I could to stop that happening. But the difference of the Labour political coalition will make it more likely that they will take tough decisions.
We need Sue Gray to be as fearsome as everyone claims she is. Side through the civil service blocking.
Yeah.
But,
and I think the other real sort of question mark over Labour, and something we haven't seen discussed enough in this campaign so far, is Boris Johnson's great sort of promise was that he was going to level up the UK economy. It obviously didn't start with Boris Johnson. It went back much further, but that was how he was planning to hold this coalition that he built in 2019 together. And it didn't happen. It was a statistic from the Centre for Cities recently that the UK economy would be 8.8% bigger if Birmingham and Manchester performed like Lyon and Frankfurt. And, I really haven't seen Labour come up with very concrete pledges, or policies for rebalancing that. I don't think there is a quick fix. And that speaks to the broader problem here, is that none of these things are easy to fix in a year or 2 years, or possibly even an election cycle, which is why, the Nigel Farages and have a chance to kind of, make inroads during that period.
Yeah, but if they do get some movement on planning, and you can see that the Labour government is trying to do its best to get out of its own way and make the civil service want to do, rather than block everything, perhaps that this is, that's fair or not. In lots of cases, I'm sure it's not. But if they do get some progress on what is an obvious problem, and indeed, therefore, there is some leveling up, not just leveling down, and business stays largely on side and they don't overdo, for instance, the employment legislation, then I think, that then all power to their elbow, because, we damn well need this. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
So I think we all agree that Labour needs to move fast, and it needs to focus on plannings, break a few things. Let's end it there. I think next week will be one day before the election, and after that, we're in a new world. We have posted our series of articles, of columns from Bloomberg Opinion columnists on 14 years of Tory rules, a whole package on tackling different issue areas, and we've put that in the X thread with this live stream. Thank you very much, Marcus Ashworth and Adrian Wooldridge. Really appreciate the discussion.
Thank you.